You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Common Descent, a podcast about paleontology, evolution, Earth history, and so on. This is episode 205, and our topic for this episode is parasitic plants.
Yeah.
As is tradition, episodes that end in a 5 are plant episodes, and that means that after the news and all that stuff, we will be joined by Dr. Ali Baumgartner, our favorite paleobotanist. We will talk about what parasitic plants are, what adaptations and lifestyles they have, how diverse they are, what their fossil record looks like, ... And they're all sorts of cool stuff about their evolutionary history. It's going to be super fun. This topic, as all of our topics, was requested, this time by Katie1, Devo, Tony, Yankee, Jesse, Kylie, Luke, Teoranosaurus, Emmett, Echevarria, and Jonathan.
Thanks for the great idea.
Absolutely. This is a super fun topic.
I'm very excited. Parasites are super cool in general. Parasitic plants are super weird. I'm very excited to learn about them.
So Parasites was episode 102. Go back and check that out for all of the details on mostly the animal side of the equation. This is like a nice little follow-up.
Yeah.
100 episodes later. Before we get into the meat of the episode, some announcements. First and foremost, as always, we have a Patreon. Everything we do on the podcast is supported by the generous support of the people who have joined us on Patreon, and they get all sorts of fun goodies in return, including bonus content. We just recently released this month's bonus noise, which includes bonus news. We do live streams. We do all sorts of fun stuff. At certain levels, patrons get their names shouted out here on the podcast. This episode, we would like to welcome new patrons, Peter and Dinogen.
Welcome. Thank you so much for your support.
Absolutely. Hey, it's November now. We are officially done with this year's spooky season. A huge thanks to everybody who has joined the conversations in the Discord, who shared fan art with us, and who joined us for our spooky live stream.
It went so well. Had a ton of fun discussing the different critters on Discord with everyone. So thank you, and check in. It's never too late to talk about spooky.
Yeah, the spooky channel is open all year round. There's always opportunities to talk about it. The end of the year is coming up, and that means two things. Number one, the end of the year Q&A is coming up. The question submission form is open all throughout November, so if you haven't submitted your question yet, you've still got time when this episode comes out. The questions have been flooding in. We're looking forward to several hours of Q&A at the end of the year. The other thing that the end of the year means is that Spotlight 2024 is almost done.
Mm-hmm.
Our second to last episode came out earlier this month with Amy and Megan from Weird and Dead. Super fun conversation. The last episode of Spotlight 2024 will be coming out at the beginning of December. This has been a super fun series. We've gotten a lot of people who have said they've enjoyed it, and I'm very excited to release our last episode for our listeners to hear.
Yes.
Also, there's mail. We have a physical mailing address, and sometimes people send us cool stuff in the mail. We got a couple of cards from Elizabeth.
Yeah, a new Star Wars postcard. Eventually, I'm going to frame all the Star Wars postcards together.
Yes.
Because Elizabeth has slowly been building my collection, and I really like these, by the way, if we haven't said that.
This feels very similar in overall tone and art style to the Last Airbender posters that you have.
Yes, it does.
So you have to get a Star Wars version.
Yep. I like these. This one also I especially like because it's Jabba's palace. So it feels very like slightly ominous tourism.
Yes.
Of like, come visit if you know what's good for you.
Yes. You can check out anytime you like. We also got a thank you email from the East Tennessee Foundation, which is one of the organizations we donated to help with disaster relief in our corner of the country after Hurricane Helene. And there was a nice, lovely video message saying thanks, where they assured us that our donation will be getting to the right people and the right places to help folks who are in need with the ongoing recovery after the hurricane. So a huge thanks to all of our supporters, because without you, we wouldn't be in a position where we would be able to make those kinds of donations.
Yes. So thank you, and good luck to everyone, and hopefully some of the support makes it your way if you need it.
Absolutely. Speaking of support, in our last episode, we mentioned we were recording right before the U.S. election, and we wished everybody was doing okay. This episode, we are recording well after the results of that election, so we extra wish that everybody is doing okay.
Yes.
To everybody out there, lots of people are struggling and concerned. We hope that you are taking care of yourselves, and we hope that you're taking care of each other.
Yeah, so take it easy however you need to, and look out for each other.
Yeah, have a drink of water, go outside and get some sun, and reach out to the people who are important to you in your life.
Yes.
That's all our announcements for this episode, which means it's time to move on to the news. Every episode, before we get into our main discussion topic, we like to talk about some news from the world of paleontology-related sciences. Keeps us up to date, keeps you up to date. Will, I'm gonna go first this time.
That's not how you break the rules!
Because I have the best news, possibly the best news of the year.
Oh?
This is the frozen saber-tooth cat.
Oh, yes.
This is the coolest. I was geeking out all weekend. This is so cool. I'm going first.
It's okay, fine.
This is research by A.V. Lopatin et al. In Scientific Reports, and we will link in the blog post to an article in Science Alert by Jess Cockrill. Researchers have identified the first ever frozen remains of a saber-tooth cat.
Ridiculous.
We do not have that.
Yeah.
That has never happened before. And not only that, it's a little kitten.
It's a kitten.
This specimen was discovered in 2020 in the Republic of Sakha in Russia. This is a region. This is also, I believe, the same region as Yakutia, where a lot of frozen remains come from. We've got mammoths, we've got woolly rhinos, cave lions, I think, have come from a similar area. But we have never before found frozen remains of any saber-toothed cats. There are lots of cats that were around during the Ice Age, cave lions, obviously, but also, tigers, leopards, jaguars, basically all the cats we have today.
Yes.
Saber-toothed cats are a wholly separate group of cats with no living descendants or close relatives. So this is a very detailed look at a group of life we've never gotten this detailed a look at before. Saber kitty is preserved by about half.
Okay.
The frozen specimen is roughly the front half of the body. The head, the neck, the chest, the front limbs. There's also some bones from the back half of the body preserved nearby, but the back half is not fully intact like the front half is.
Gotcha.
Comparing the anatomy of this cat with modern cats, throughout the paper they compare it with a lion cub, like a newborn lion cub that I guess they had a specimen available. They determine that this saber-toothed kitten was, at the time of its death, roughly 3 weeks old.
Very young.
This is a little baby. It's a little baby cat. Radiocarbon dates from the fur, which they refer to in the paper as wool, which is very cool. Put it at about 36,000 years old, so towards the end of the Ice Age. Now, we cannot identify saber-toothed cats from the outside when they've got all their fur and hair and flesh and everything on them because we've never seen their fur and hair and flesh and everything on them before. So, to get a closer look, they did a CT scan to get the shape of the anatomy inside. They noticed a number of features that are characteristic of saber-toothed cats. Wide cheekbones and a round brain case. Also those flanges that come off the chin. If you look at the bone of the lower jaw of a saber-toothed cat, they often have this little downward tilt of the chin. This little extension.
Yes.
That comes off the bottom of the lower jaw.
It kind of looks like little shoehorns.
Yeah, and it's probably there to help support the long canines when the mouth is closed.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, it also has saber teeth.
Whee!
Not much saber teeth. This is a approximately 3-week-old little saber-tooth cub, and those canines are just starting to poke out of the upper jaw, but they are still recognizably there.
Yes. Very, very cool.
So cool. They were even able to identify it to a species by comparing with known fossil specimens. The species Homotherium latidens. Homotherium is known from all over the place, Europe, Asia, Africa, even over here in the Americas, as far back as the Middle Pliocene, so 4 million years ago or so.
It's one of those where even though Smilodon is definitely the more famous name that you'll hear, if you just, like, went to a random site with sabertooths, you'll probably hear Holothurium more, like...
Yes.
That's the name that pops up just all the time, because it was super common.
Not only is this obviously the first time we've ever seen a frozen Homotherium, it's also an age extension for the group.
Oh!
Because apparently Homotherium has never been found before in the late Pleistocene of Asia.
Oh!
So it's there earlier, but this is the youngest Asian specimen of Homotherium as well. Which is pretty cool.
Okay, cool. Pulling double duty there, little kitten.
It's so... this is already a monumental discovery before I get to the next part, which is that it's frozen in ice.
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to preserving the skull and the bones and stuff, it preserves fur and presumably eyeballs, although they're not mentioned in the paper, and tissue and muscles and skin. It's just the front half of this cat.
Yep.
The fur is short and thick and dark brown. It's longer in some places on the back and the neck and also the corners of the mouth, which I've seen some paleo art that have interpreted that, and it gives it this sort of like droopy fur on the side of the mouth.
Yes.
It also preserves 2 rows of whiskers on the upper lip.
I told Anna about this, and she was like, this is super cool. And then she happened to see a picture, and she's like, you didn't tell me there were whiskers!
There's whiskers, yeah. It's adorable. Oh my goodness. Speaking of which, the upper lip they also... So again, like I said, they're comparing it to a 3-week-old lion cub specimen, and they note that overall they're very similar in general size and shape. A few of the differences, but besides those skeletal changes, are the upper lip is extra tall.
Cool.
They say it is more than twice as high, from nose to the bottom of the upper lip, as in a lion, likely to form a space for that growing in canine to be covered up. There actually was I don't remember if we talked about this on the podcast, but not too long ago there was a paper that came out looking specifically at Homotherium that interpreted that based on the skeletal structure, they probably had their saber teeth mostly or fully covered by their lips when the mouth was closed.
That they had jowls to keep the teeth, quote unquote, in the mouth.
Yes, exactly.
Not poking out. Which is one of the things I was most excited to see if we got any indication on with this this kitten.
They didn't mention anything really about that specifically, other than that the upper lip is extra tall. Mm-hmm. It's also hard to see in this one because those upper canines are not yet erupted.
Yes,
because it is just a little baby.
It's just a little guy.
So far I didn't see any discussion in the paper about like if there's a pocket in the lower lip.
Yeah.
I assume there will be further research that looks into things like that. Also, comparing with the lion, they found that its oral fissure, so its mouth, the opening for its mouth, is bigger.
Yeah.
I think they said something like 15% bigger, which makes sense because we know saber-toothed cats had an extra wide gape.
Yes.
They could open their mouth wider than modern cats, which obviously, again, makes sense because there's giant teeth in there.
Which I now want everyone to picture little kitten yawn, but 50% more.
Yes. Mauricio Anton did an art recently that he posted online of Homotherium, and it includes the adult yawning with his big teeth sticking out.
And now you can just picture it with some detailed images of what it would look like for a kitten.
Just a little kid, just a big stretch.
Just so wide.
They also noted that the external ears of the saber kitty are smaller than the lion cub.
Okay.
Which they point out is an adaptation we often see in mammals that live in colder climates.
Yep.
Because when you're in a cold place, you don't want extremities to be as extreme.
Yes, yeah, we've got a cold versus hot cat here, and so that makes perfect sense.
A lot of cold climate mammals today, for example, have shorter legs. Mm-hmm. It just keeps everything closer to the warm core of the body.
Keeps it toward the warmth. Also means that there's less exposed area out in the cold air.
Yes.
You're reducing your surface area.
Also, because basically the whole front half is preserved in ice, they were able to examine the shape of its paws. Eee! The paws have all the little pads on them.
Toe beans!
It's got toe beans. It's got ancient toe beans. They noted that compared to the lion, which they were comparing it to, the paws are wider and rounder in the saber-toothed cat. And it also doesn't have carpal pads. Oh. So if you look at the paw of a dog or a cat, it's got pads under the toes, and then it's got pads sort of on the palm.
Yeah, quote unquote.
But then there's a pad farther back towards the wrist area. This cat doesn't have that. And that, apparently, for reasons that I can infer, is something we also see in colder climate animals.
Yeah.
That I assume that it's reducing the amount of skin that is exposed to the elements, and instead that's covered with fur.
I also wonder if, it's like with the roundness of the paws, if the overall anatomy has anything to do with walking over snow.
And they also mentioned that yes, the wide round paws are possibly an adaptation for moving across snow.
You little snowshoes.
Yes. Now, they didn't compare it directly with, like, snow leopards,
yes.
Big cats today. I assume just because the lion was the specimen they had access to.
Yeah, I'm sure we will see many a more comparison and analysis soon to come.
Having not worked on cats myself, I can only assume that if you require an extremely young big cat cub for research purposes, the easiest one to get access to is a lion.
Oh, yeah, surely.
Because there are zoos everywhere. They live in big groups. I imagine snow leopard cubs are a lot harder to come by for research purposes.
Yeah, they've got kind of like the American alligator thing of, we've been caring for you and breeding populations in human care for centuries? I don't know what the earliest line in human care was, but a long time ago.
It's also, like alligators, easy to find lots of them.
Yep.
They tend to group.
Yes.
As opposed to a snow leopard that you could walk across all of Asia and not see a snow leopard.
People have difficulty getting video footage of.
Yes, exactly. So this cub shows us a whole bunch of new stuff that we didn't know before about the soft tissue. It also shows us some stuff that we were right about. It confirms some hypotheses. The most exciting one is that in saber-toothed cats, you'll often see this in paleo art, we've talked about this before, based on their skeleton, saber-toothed cats are often interpreted as being very muscular.
Yes.
The front arms are very muscular, the neck and the back are very muscular. This is inferred based on the shape of the bones, where the muscles would attach, and it tends to be linked to probably behavioral stuff where they are grappling with their prey, they're using their head and neck in very powerful ways, coupled with those giant canines.
Yeah, they're often compared to wrestlers.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the way they're taking things down.
The saber-toothed kitten is very muscly. We can see the muscles underneath the skin. It has very thick musculature, particularly around the neck. They point out in the paper, and there's also a figure with pictures that shows this. The saber-toothed kitten's neck is more than twice as thick as the lion cub.
Wow.
It is this huge... It's very... You can barely see that there's a neck there.
It's a Rottweiler of a kitten.
Yeah.
Wow.
For just those big... moving that head around.
Man. What would it have been like to pull that kitten up by the scruff?
I did see someone online comment on that where they were like, and this wasn't this was just a comment on social media somewhere where someone said, well, yeah, it had to have all that extra flesh up there because imagine getting picked up by a parent with saber teeth.
You gotta just have the loosest of skin so it just folds around those daggers.
I assume that a saber-toothed parent would pick them up with just the incisors.
Yep.
Which, incidentally, are also extra big in saber-toothed cats.
Yes.
The incisors are caniniform. Mm-hmm. They are canine-like, and this little cat also has bigger, rounder incisors.
Well, it also makes me wonder, and this is something I don't know much about, is how consistent is the way cats carry their young? Because I've seen videos of lions where they don't pick up by the scruff, they pick up by the head. Like, where they will just around the kittens.
They do that. Maybe they didn't do that in Lion King.
I feel like they did when he is getting groomed before his...
Yeah, I think he gets picked up by the head.
Yeah, and it's like I definitely have seen that in documentaries where they just and do all big cats use the scruff? How many use the scruff?
That's a good question.
Are there other ways a saber-toothed cat
Does a saber-toothed cat not pick them up with your mouth?
Yes, exactly.
For that very reason.
Are there other ways that it's
Or
like,
is
actually, there's this cat does not pick up their kittens ever.
Just by like a foot.
Yes.
Just so that it can fit in between you just slurp it up and then you drag them around. This is so cool.
It's ridiculous.
The paper is open access, so you can go check it out. We'll put a link to the article in the blog post, but you can follow to the paper from there. There are pictures of it. This is one of the coolest discoveries ever.
Well, and it's got that thing of, it's so exciting because frozen animal,
always cool,
always a big deal,
always exciting. In our last bonus news, we talked about frozen woolly rhino.
Absolutely.
A young woolly rhino.
Yes, so like, that's always exciting. It's from a group we don't have.
Yep.
And then it's from an age range that is often very rare. Like, finding very, very young individuals in the fossil record in general is tough. So, like, am I waiting for us to find an adult so I can see what the teeth look like in the lips?
100%.
Yes, that is the thing I want to know so bad. But finding a kitten is huge, because now, like, if we do, and even just comparing it to the skeletons of adults, this is going to be huge for learning about their development, for understanding how they grew and how their lifestyle might have changed, and just huge for understanding this stuff.
Yeah. I feel like, and I could be wrong about this, but certainly off the top of my head, I think this is the most distantly related to modern species of any frozen Ice Age animal we have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because woolly mammoths we have, but those are extremely closely related to modern elephants.
Yes.
Woolly rhinos, I don't know exactly how closely related, but I feel like they're pretty closely related to modern rhinos.
Yeah.
Saber-toothed cats are separated, they diverged from all modern cat lineages like 20 million years ago.
Yep, they are distinct from the cat groups we know.
Yeah, this is much more akin to finding a frozen ground sloth.
Yes.
Like this is a type of animal we do not have anymore, which is so cool.
Well, and it's exciting because, like, we were right about stuff, so, like, that's
always nice. Always nice to be right about
so
stuff.
Well, and it's that satisfying of, like, yay, you all did a great job, but also, like, science proof, like, the predictive power of science that's the actual core of science, and when it gets confirmed, it is so satisfying. And I also like the things that, like, aren't typically mentioned, but, like, they also have round ears, and, like, we expect them to, because most big cats do, but they also did. Like, we've always assumed they did.
We know.
But they indeed did, which I like those things that aren't surprises, but also we shouldn't like, there was no way for us to actually confirm what their ear shape was. Well, we were just assuming.
And this is a funny little thing that I thought, and I'm sure I'm one of the only people that has thought this. When the topic of dinosaurs with feathers come up, we've talked about this a bunch on the podcast, and sometimes, it would come up especially with T-Rex, and people would go, well, there's no direct evidence of T-Rex having feathers. And I always like to say, well, there's also no direct evidence of saber-toothed cats having fur.
Yes.
To point out that, we make inferences based on other data. Well, that's not true anymore.
Yeah!
Now, this is it. This is the specimen that proves that saber-toothed cats had fur, which of course they did. No one thought otherwise, but now I have to find a different animal to say that about.
Yep. Oh, it's so cool.
It's so cool. It's the best. All right, Will, talk about whatever silly thing you want to talk about.
I want to talk about...
My second news is also extremely cool. It's like, we've got a lot of other cool news.
Shut up.
I thought about, should I do this one first, or should I do it last? I was like, nah, we got to front load this.
Get it out of the way so that we can so then we don't pull the Titanoboa thing and one up all the news afterward.
Yes.
Just get it out of the way.
Everybody's just not listening. Everyone's like, all right, when does the discussion start?
My news is about a robotic plesiosaur model looking at not just how they might have swam, but how their swimming might adjust in different situations.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
All right, that's cool.
This is research by Akira Fukuhara et al. In Scientific Reports. And the article is a press release from Tohoku University in phys.org. This research was really looking at the broader topic of how do we study locomotion in ancient species. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this before of how do we study behavior and how do we study, body mechanics. Talking about how an ancient animal moved can be very tricky because that is a very complex series of mechanisms. You have the bones, you have the muscles, you have the weight of the animal, you have the speed and, environment of the animal. They also were making the point that animals don't move just one way.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that a lot of times kind of can get overlooked when we talk about, based off of what we can see, they probably moved like this. It's like, all right, but you could watch me walk down the hall, and that's not the same way I walk when I'm out on for exercise or going up the stairs on all fours.
Yes.
Animals can move in very different ways, and even just in subtle ways. This came up when we were talking about the run walking in emus and stuff.
Yes, that was also in bonus news.
That an animal can shift through many gaits depending on the situation. So they were wanting to try to understand how can we study that in ancient organisms.
All right, very cool.
How can we try to get an insight into that? They decided to use plesiosaurs because
episode 72.
They are an extinct organism with a very unique body plan.
Yes.
4 large flippers, which is unlike any swimming organism we have around today. That's not sea turtles and penguins have front flippers that are big and not big back flippers. They had 4 equally sized, roughly, flippers. And they can be modeled similarly to tetrapods, 4-limbed walking animals.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
They're saying all in all for a swimming organism, it's a fairly similar, that arms and legs are kind of equivalent in a lot of animals. Like a dog's front legs and back legs are fairly similar in dimensions.
Yeah.
So they go through similar different paces. Could we test that out in a plesiosaur?
Interesting. Plesiosaurs are also unusual in their body shape for typically having relatively short tails and often having very long necks.
Yes.
Which is also different from a lot of other aquatic tetrapods.
And they don't deal with the neck in this study, but they do mention that in future studies they hope to incorporate the neck into the future models. So they made a robot that is basically half a plesiosaur with 2 flippers in the water.
Cool.
And
the bottom half of a plesiosaur?
Well, it's one half of a plesiosaur.
Oh, I said the left half of a plesiosaur.
But placed downward into the water.
I gotcha.
And then they can do a flow of water over it and have the flippers move at alternating paces.
Yeah.
So they can alternate I think they were alternating the hertz of the voltage or system so that they could just slightly adjust and see a different pattern of the flippers moving together, moving, opposite, moving just in line, slightly,
Right, slightly offset.
Yeah. It's like if you've ever seen those videos of people swinging a bunch of pendulums with different lengthed string, and that they start in sync and then slowly go out of sync, but they move through a series of patterns with each other as they all move through these different frequencies. They did a similar thing with the flippers here just to see what kinds of patterns of efficiency and gaits do we see. They drew off of something called interlimb coordination mechanics, which is something we see in 4-limbed animals where the way you move, the limbs are adjusting to each other.
Right. You're not just moving them all completely separately.
Yes.
They are relative to each other.
Their motion is informing each other. They developed an autonomous, decentralized control system, which they developed a system that basically lets the flippers talk to each other, from what it sounded like. There's parts of this that I don't fully understand because it's robotics programming. Yeah, we're getting into computer stuff that...
Put in your request now for a robots episode.
Fully over my head.
We're not going to do a robots episode.
Nope.
I'm so sorry.
This is a system, though, that...
Sorry, our computer just shut down in protest.
Dr. Grant touched it. They then put this system through a series of paces and found that it generated coordinated patterns between the flippers, but varying amounts. There's a great video on the article that you can watch of the flippers doing that pendulum thing of they start together and then slowly move through a series of different patterns between the two flippers. They said that they found a simple local sensory feedback mechanism, which was the thing that letting them kind of talk to each other from the sound of it, allowed them to exploit the fluid flow between the flippers. So like a fairly simple communication system between the two allowed them to adjust and take advantage of the flow of the fluid between the two flippers.
Yeah.
And generated various efficient swimming patterns. So this is, once again, more about how can we try to understand not the specific way plesiosaurs move, but how their movements might have adjusted and how could we study this in ancient animals. So this is more of a proof of concept. And they talked about that this could be a new way of looking at movement in extinct organisms.
Yeah.
As I said, they hope to do future ones taking into consideration more of the body and how that might be adjusted. Could they adjust the position of the neck and position of the body in addition to the movement of the flippers for different kinds of locomotion?
Yeah, it's really interesting to compare. So often we compare walking with other walking animals and swimming with other swimming animals. But to compare plesiosaurs with land walking animals because of the way that their arms and legs move is a very interesting angle. And also, I don't think I've ever, we have talked a whole bunch on the podcast. Episode 193, we talked about this a whole lot, about how terrestrial animals use different gaits.
Yes.
Walking and running and trotting and whatever else. I have spent very little time thinking about different gaits of aquatic locomotion. That you move differently if it's slower versus speedy movement versus in an enclosed space.
Yeah, it's a thing that because it's on one hand so supremely complex.
Yes,
like that came up a little bit when I was doing the toothed whales notes and found out that there's so much research on swimming dynamics in dolphins.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We've studied them a ton for the hydrodynamics and swimming mechanics of how they move. And they have names for the various strokes and swimming patterns that they use. And there's a lot of nuance because it's like, it's the thing of where do you draw the line between different types of running?
Right,
like,
exactly.
I don't run at full speed the same way I do when I jog.
Yes.
Like my body is moving very differently.
Also, we don't run in 3 dimensions.
Yes, exactly.
A dolphin can swim. There may be a different... Well, and that's trying to find the efficient gait.
Yes.
Depends on your circumstances.
Yes, exactly.
An animal doesn't have just one efficient way of moving.
Yeah, so this is a cool... And it's always a nice reminder of... There's never just one answer when we're talking about animals.
Yeah.
There's a variety. There's going to be nuance and diversity to the thing they're doing.
Very cool. Well, hey, it just so happens that my second news is also about legs and locomotion and the evolution of how things move. Specifically, this is about wings and some interesting comparisons between bird and bat wing evolution.
Cool.
This is research in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution by Andrew Orkney, David Burma, and Brandon Hedrick, and we will link in the blog post to a press release by Elodie Smith of Cornell University in phys.org. Flying vertebrates use their arms to fly. Birds, bats, pterosaurs, their front limbs have adapted into wings in order to carry them through the air. There is lots of research on the evolution of how that happens, how that arm becomes a wing, what evolutionary pressures are directing what sort of features develop. But this paper starts by pointing out that often the legs and arms of flying vertebrates are considered somewhat separately.
Yeah.
Because they are evolving differently because they're doing different things.
Yes.
Right? A bird's legs and a bird's arms have basically nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, arguably opposite jobs.
Yes, exactly. As opposed to like a horse whose limbs are all doing the same thing and in theory should be evolving in very similar directions. Birds use their legs for running, hopping, perching, grabbing, things that their wings are not doing. So in this study, they took a look at not just how the limbs evolve over time, but how they evolve relative to each other. Mm-hmm. When we see an evolutionary pattern in the arms, what do we see going on in the legs? And is there any sort of correlation between them? To find this out, they put together limb bone measurements from 149 living bird species and 111 living bat species.
Nice.
They found that in all across the board, the bones within one limb are strongly correlated with each other in regards to their evolution. So, like, in the arm, the humerus, the radius, the ulna, they all exhibit very similar evolutionary patterns, right?
Mm-hmm.
If one starts getting longer, the other ones get longer, or whatever the pattern is, they are very tightly correlated, which makes tons of sense because that's one arm and it's doing the same thing.
Yes.
They also noted that the legs and the arms, the wings and the legs, don't follow very similar patterns in birds.
Yeah.
As expected, bird legs and arms are doing very different things, and there is no real correlation between their evolutionary paths. Bats were different.
Yeah.
In bats, the wings and the legs were strongly correlated in their evolutionary patterns. When something adjusted over time in the forelimbs, you saw a very similar change in the hind limbs. This is most likely because in bats, the legs are also part of the wing.
Yeah.
Like the wing membrane attaches to the legs. If I remember correctly, it varies depending on the bat species.
Yes.
I think it's often to the ankle, but I feel like there are some where maybe it's more to the knee.
Yep.
It also varies how much it connects to the tail, but the leg is contributing to part of the wing opening mechanism.
Yeah, like I think the ankle is kind of your default.
I think so, and I might be wrong about the knee thing. Go episode 59, go back and listen to me and tell me that I'm wrong about this. They did find different evolutionary patterns that seem to be related to different lifestyle aspects, but they weren't as easy as wings doing one thing, legs doing the other thing.
Yeah.
They found that across different flight styles, so species that flew in different ways, we saw most variation in the outer wing bones. So far, towards the hand and the fingers, there was a lot of variation, but variation in the legs and the thumb on the hands mostly seemed to be related to variation in roosting behaviors.
Makes sense.
But that the thumb is not strongly correlated with other parts of the wing. Which also makes sense because the thumb isn't helping with flight.
Yes.
The thumb is just sticking off doing its own thing, helping for grasping stuff.
It has a different job.
And grasping stuff is also one of the jobs that the hind legs are doing.
Yeah.
This means, all of this makes a lot of sense once you sort of lay it out. But what it means is that birds and bats' limb evolution is very different from each other.
Yeah, it is.
That bat legs and wings are much more tightly correlated. They also make the note that this might be part of the reason why bats are relatively limited in their locomotion.
Yes.
Like, we don't see birds, tons of birds are great at running and jumping. We also have a lot of flightless birds. They point out that this link between the legs and the arms might be a limiting factor on bats that makes it harder because their legs can't just go fully 100% into evolving into great running structures because they are constrained by whatever the arms are doing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you now need to turn part of your wing into legs again.
Yes.
And that's going to take away part of your wing. So that's awesome. It's a great example of, like, the more I learn about birds and bats, the more the point gets made that, yes, there are two flying vertebrates that we have today, and the two famous flying animals that you think of, other than insects, but, like, they are the two armed flying, like, their arms are their wings.
Right. And they have a lot in common.
Yeah, and they get compared to each other, but really they are two fundamentally different ways to be a flying vertebrate.
Yeah.
Like, they are functioning and living and being in the air in very different ways. Like, bats are much more efficient than birds at slow speeds, because they are flapping in a fundamentally different way than birds.
Yes. Well, and their wings are shaped in a fundamentally different way.
Yes.
They have a lot in common, but they are very much like when we compare birds and bats to insects.
Yes.
Yeah, they're flying, but they're doing it very differently.
And so it's a good reminder that bats are not mammal birds.
Yes.
Bats are bats.
Bats are bats.
They are their own thing, and they're doing it in they're doing it even very differently than pterosaurs, who also had membrane wings.
Yes, and the authors do point out that this does raise similar questions now about pterosaurs.
Yes.
And I assume that somebody now wants to do this same sort of study, but now looking at pterosaurs.
Yes, please.
Are their arms and legs correlated in their evolutionary patterns?
Yes, or for the fact that a lot of them were big-time walkers, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have a third different pattern?
Yes, right.
That's weird. So cool. Well, my last news is this is kind of a nice sandwich, is also about an extremely well-preserved specimen, but one we already knew about, Borealopelta.
Sure.
But this is research on its armor, because we had to look at its armor in a way we've never gotten on an ankylosaur.
Ooh.
Yeah. This is research by Michael Habib et al. In SVP 84th annual meeting. So this is a excerpt from the SVP catalog, the document.
Yes. So this presumably isn't a full paper that has been published.
This has been presented on. There is an article, though, by Sierra Boucher in Life Science. So this research is on Borealopelta. Famously, a specimen of Borealopelta was discovered that was what was described many a time as mummified.
Yeah, it looks like a gargoyle.
Yep.
But Borealopelta is one of the armored dinosaurs. This one was discovered up in Canada, if I remember correctly.
I believe
Alberta.
so. This is one of the best preserved dinosaurs, and often described as the best preserved dinosaur we've ever found.
Yes. Yeah, this is the frozen saber-tooth kitty of ankylosaurs.
Yep. It was famous for being 3D reconstruction, so we know exactly how this dinosaur was shaped. It preserves soft tissue, so we have evidence of the coloration on the skin. Stomach content was preserved. Beautiful, beautiful specimen. It also preserved the keratin on the armored spikes of its armored body.
Yeah.
This research is looking into that. So Borealopelta is an ankylosaur, an armored dinosaur, specifically a nodosaur.
Mm-hmm. So it didn't have a tail club.
Didn't have a tail club.
I don't think that the tail is preserved in Borealopelta.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But nodosaurs didn't have tail clubs.
But they were still heavily armored. They have a body covered in osteoderm, so those bony skin ornamentations and armor. Many of them formed spikes, interlocking plates. We have often suspected and seen evidence that they would have been covered in keratin, like a turtle shell. Mm-hmm. So keratin's what our fingers and hair are made out of, but in
scales as well.
Scales. In turtles, there's the bony shell, and then there are sheets of keratin over the shell. This is what makes up that famous tortoise hexagon pattern, is keratin. We've suspected and seen evidence that the armor in these dinosaurs would have also been covered by keratin, but keratin does not fossilize the way bone does, so we have not ever gotten it, except in Borealopelta. Mm-hmm. It's our only physical example, and so they did an analysis of the keratin, first off just to get a kind of taking stock of what is it like on this dinosaur, and it's ridiculous. It's much thicker than they had anticipated.
Ooh.
They found that in some areas it was nearly 6.3 inches thick. On the spikes, it looked like 6 inches of keratin.
Wow. So on a horn.
Yes. So 16 centimeters is what we're talking about. And it was still overall just thick across the body. They said in contrast, the keratin sheath of a cattle horn, cow horn, is typically only 0.6 inches thick or 1.5 centimeters.
Wow.
So really thick areas, thick over the body. This got them to ask the question of how would this affect its functioning as armor? Because keratin has very different textile qualities than bone does. Keratin typically is in layers, and this gives it a great ability to absorb impact and damage. This is mainly due to the large amount of energy it takes to separate the layers. So doing damage to keratin takes quite a bit.
Yeah. It's kind of like how a windshield on a car is multi-layered.
Exactly. I was about to say, it's kind of like the plexiglass of the animal world. So they wanted to take a look at what would the biomechanics of this armor be actually, since we actually now know what the full composite material, we have the bones and the keratin layer. Beforehand, we only had the bones, which would give very different results because bones shatter much more easily than keratin does. Bones are tough, but once you hit their breaking point, they break, while keratin doesn't do that same thing. So they examined the energy absorption and dynamic load specializations of the armor. They used keratin material, reports on it from other living animals so that we can get a comparison. They used things like keratin armor from animals that use it protectively. They use the example of porcupines, but there are other, turtles also have that keratin armor. And keratin bone composites like bones in the bovids, cattle, and so forth. These were their baselines. They applied this to the model of the measured osteoderms and keratin in Borealopelta and accounted for the relative, range of thicknesses across the body of the armor. And conservative estimates of the armor was that it was capable of absorbing over 125,000 joules of energy per square meter, which that number doesn't mean anything to most people.
Absolutely not.
The example they used is that is energy value similar to a high-speed automobile collision. Basically, from this, it seems like Borealopelta maybe could have tanked a car crash.
Getting hit by a car.
That you could drive a car into Borealopelta, and its armor might be able to withstand that. That's intense.
That's tough.
The way they put it was these animals were not wearing plate armor. They were wearing bulletproof vest over plate armor. They had a layer of Kevlar over steel plate.
It's very funny because we often refer to ankylosaurs as living tanks. This really does drive that comparison home.
Yeah. This is, on one hand, expected that they have high defenses because they lived at a time with large predators.
Sure. And also their bones are obviously, you are very adapted to being very defensive.
And there were some big theropods that are known to have extreme bites.
Yeah, Ankylosaurus lived alongside T-Rex, which had a preposterous bite force.
But they do note that this level of defense is excessive even for the highest bite forces estimated for these predators. It is overbuilt, is one of the quotes they used, for what we would expect from its predators. So they suspect that the armor probably is mainly evolved for competition between nodosaurs.
Yeah.
With predation defense being secondary, that when they compete, probably with like side to side, jousting with the horns on their edges.
Yes.
That this armor was much more for defense against each other, and then predator defense was a secondary benefit.
Yeah. Well, kind of the way that, we were making the comparison with, bison and cattle and stuff. They've got those horns, which are useful for fending off a predator.
Absolutely.
But most of the time what they're using those horns for is for fighting each other.
Yes, they're most important for interlocking and butting heads against each other.
Yes.
And then, I'm going to use whatever weapon I have when teeth are coming at me. They also noted that, and this goes in line with that competition defense, that with the full keratin across the back, the osteoderms on its backside, on the top surface of the animal, would have been nearly interlocking. And that when shoulder-to-shoulder combat happened and compression across the back was put on the animal, the load would be dispersed across that axis. So that it seems like, this armor is made to not only defend but reinforce the animal when they're butting shoulders, is the way, like football player checking each other.
Yeah. This immediately makes me think two things. Number one, as we mentioned, nodosaurs generally don't have tail clubs.
Yes.
Which makes me wonder what the keratin armor on Ankylosaurus looked like.
Oh, yeah.
Were you also fighting with your tail clubs?
Yep.
Because, that would... But also, the second thing it makes me wonder is how violent were Ankylosaur fights?
Yeah.
Like, that's a lot, you watch the way that, like, rams today will headbutt each other, and that is a thick, dense bony armor covering on their head, and then you watch them fight, and it is shockingly violent. Because they can take it. They are built to withstand that.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's fine. They're going to be okay. And Kyle, this Borealopelta was built to take a lot of damage.
Was this that, but with an animal that's 18 feet long?
Yeah.
Like a nearly 20-foot animal.
What, would you hear it?
Yeah.
Would you be able to just hear crack echoing across the forest?
I could almost picture them using a similar mechanic to the rams, where the rams aren't running at each other. They lift on their back legs and fall into the hit.
That you would sway.
Yeah, that you just tilt.
Like you're trying to knock out a door.
Yes, but just at another animal.
Yeah.
And that impact had to be, for anyone else, bone-shattering.
Absolutely. Just completely wipe you out. Well, I do wonder, and Borealopelta off the top of my head, I don't know, but a lot of their armor is not only spiky, but knobby.
Yes, yeah.
So I would also wonder if it's about resisting the pressure.
That's what I was thinking, too.
Of those relatively narrow points.
And also, are you...
Even if I'm not actually hitting all that hard, I'm driving these little knobs into the opponent.
Well, and is that grinding, and are you sitting there pressing and grinding against each other to try to get the upper hand? And yet you need to resist sustained, not just an impact, but consistent pressure. Who knows how long the fights went on.
Wow. It's funny how often we do a side series, dear listeners, called Silver Screen Science. One of the things we talk about a lot in Silver Screen Science is the ways that real life animals are exaggerated to make them more compelling as a movie creature. And one of the very common ways that movies will do that is by making their movie animal impossible to hurt.
Yeah, unreasonably durable.
Yeah, they'll get shot a bunch of times, they'll get hit by stuff, and then they just walk it off.
They're running through walls.
This sounds like an animal that actually could do that.
Yep.
That this would be an animal that you could just hit with a baseball bat and it would just look at you annoyed and then walk away.
Yeah.
Or shoulder check you through a wall.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got the thing when people go hunting for alligators and crocs of the way you hunt them is a brain shot, because shooting them at a distance with any weapon, you're probably just going to do surface level damage because they're covered in bone and armor. I don't even know what you would shoot at them with that is a reasonable thing to go hunting with.
A Borealopelta gun.
Yes, right. Use depleted uranium.
Well, it makes me think of the scene in Jurassic World where they shoot a RPG, I think, at Indominus.
Yeah.
And it blows up and it falls over and gets up and walks away. And I was like, come on, what?
Whoa.
But now I'm like, no, maybe Borealopelta.
It had Borealopelta DNA.
It had Borealopelta.
We didn't get to that when they were listing them all off.
It just had 6-inch thick keratin around its outside. That's super cool.
It's so cool.
Oh my goodness. Dear listeners, please do not go out and shoot and or hit with a baseball bat and or run over dinosaurs.
Yeah, no. When they're crossing the road, still let them cross.
Just stop. You're gonna lose that.
What? And it's gonna. Yeah, that's just your insurance. Just
call the insurance. Absolutely. Just listen. Don't worry about it.
Oh, they said that this will be huge for informing how we interpret other keratinized dinosaurs, the other armored dinosaurs, but also ceratopsians and horned dinosaurs. Have we been misinterpreting what their keratin might be like? And just a good note to keep in mind for how we interpret this missing part of the anatomy.
Very cool stuff. I hope that gets published before too long.
Yes.
And we get to see the whole paper. Well, hey, you know what that thick armor wouldn't have protected Borealopelta from? Parasites.
Borealopelta, if you were a tree, you'd be in trouble.
Listen, that historium's getting in there anyway. Specifically parasitic plants, because parasitic plants tend not to parasitize animals. So Borealopelta wouldn't even have to have worried about it.
Yeah, you were over-armored for more things than you knew.
But with that segue, that's the news. We're going to wrap up the news and we're going to move on to our main event. So after this short musical interlude, we will be joined by Dr. Ali Baumgartner to talk to us about parasitic plants. Don't go anywhere. Unless you can go wherever you want. You can pause it and then come back to it.
But you shouldn't, because Ali's about to be here.
Ali's going to be here and it's going to be great. Hello, Allie.
Hello, David.
Welcome back. It's been so long since you've been here on the podcast.
I was thinking about that. I was like, wait, I feel like I just did that.
This has been been a good year for all the Allie fans in our audience.
So
a
many
lot
plants.
of Allie. Last time you were here, we talked a whole lot about fungi and plants, and that meant that our discussion inevitably included a lot of discussion of parasites.
Correct.
Parasites of plants.
Yes.
And so after that, we were excited about the continuing that trend. So welcome back to talk about parasitic plants this time around.
Ooh, I'm very excited. I gotta say though, trying to just Google parasitic plants is a pain because you have to phrase it very carefully. Otherwise, you get the parasites of the plants. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
I want the parasitic plants.
Well, because that's the thing people are typically Googling is, why is my plant turning yellow?
Yes.
What is this thing on my plant? How do I get rid of these bugs?
Yes.
Sometimes you go looking for resources on a particular topic in biology and you find yourself in agriculture or horticulture or gardening.
Or you
Yes.
discover
You're like,
that there's a video game or a thing that happens to have the same name, and that's way more popular than your topic.
Not exactly the same, but that is something that will definitely come up in this discussion, that like, oh, there is a different thing that has the same name. Well, that's inconvenient.
Yep.
Oh, wonderful.
Yep.
Well, let's begin with the question of, Allie, what does it mean for a plant to be parasitic? How do they do it?
So much like animals, for a plant to be parasitic, that means that it is taking its nutrients from somewhere else, right? So it is not photosynthesizing, at least not only photosynthesizing and making its own energy. This is not to be confused, and I'm going to get this out of the way at the beginning. This is not to be confused with mycoheterotrophs. They are parasitic plants, but they are not parasitic on plants. They are parasitic indirectly of plants through fungi. And I already talked about mycoheterotrophs.
That was in episode 201. We're talking about plants that are cutting out the middle step.
Yes,
exactly. So I talked about many mycoheterotrophs, or like multiple mycoheterotrophs in that, including the only parasitic gymnosperm. So that is a mycoheterotroph. I will not be talking about this. I already did that, so I am covering my bases.
We have talked enough about fungi. Come back in another 7 years.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, in general, basically, a parasitic plant gets its nutrients from another plant and doesn't do its own photosynthesis.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Excellent. A very odd lifestyle choice for plants.
Oh, absolutely.
To not do the thing that plants that's their thing.
Yeah.
Is photosynthesizing.
There are basically three main categories of life cycles that are like lifestyles, I think would be a better way to put it, of plants. So you have your autotrophs, right? Like these are plants. They eat sunlight, they make their energy. You have the mycoheterotrophs, and then you have the parasitic plants. And those are basically your three options. Most plants are in that first option. They make their own food and they just do it themselves.
Yes.
So as you just said, most plants are in that first category. How much plants are in this category? I can think of a couple of examples off the top of my head of parasitic plants. How widespread is this?
So I mentioned at the very beginning, right, that there is a mycoheterotrophic gymnosperm, but that is the only example of a parasitic gymnosperm. Most, if not all, parasitic plants that I could find any information about are flowering plants.
Interesting.
They make up about 1% of all flowering plants and are present in almost every biome, like terrestrial biome.
Cool.
They're very widespread. So they are found in about 20 families of angiosperms. So it's roughly 4,500 or so species, which is not nothing. I mean, the grand scheme of angiosperms, it's barely anything, but they take this very seriously. So there are the order Santolales is the largest single group of parasitic plants. So there are roughly 179 genera in this order, with almost 2,500 species and about 12 families or so. A little less than that, but in a different order, Orobanchaceae is the single largest family of any of the flowering plants that are parasitic. So they have about 102 genera and about 2,100 species. So in general, there's about 20 families or so that have parasitic members, and this is the part where I ask you, hey, how many times do you think that this parasitic lifestyle evolved in angiosperms? So it's present in 20 families, 1% of all angiosperms.
I'm going to go with 20.
Okay.
That seems like a number I heard.
10.
All right.
So if we're doing Price is Right rules, it's definitely will. So it's about 12 times.
Hey,
Okay,
all
cool.
right.
Yeah. So this is definitely polyphyletic. This is arising all over the angiosperm family tree. The interesting thing about it is that there are no known monocots that are parasitic plants.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So like grasses and stuff
Yeah.
are monocots?
Yes. So monocots, those are going to be, they get parasitized a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, no monocots. So your corns, your wheats, all of those things, they do not, grasses, they do not have this parasitic lifestyle. I don't know why. But it is across the rest of the angiosperm family tree. So the eudicots, the basal angiosperms, everybody else is doing it.
That's surprising me just because of how taken over the world is by grasses and their cousins in this day and age. Like, it's kind of surprising they haven't just stumbled into that.
Yeah, I don't know a good explanation why. I wonder if it is just because of the types of environments they're living in, the types of life cycles that they're living in, that they don't need to for whatever reason. You know, I'm not sure. I would ask them if I could, but unfortunately.
It's an interesting contrast with parasitism in animals, which we talked about in episode 102. Parasites are thought to make up something like half of all animals.
Yeah.
Parasitism has evolved over and over and over and over. Like, animals are really, really good at being parasites. When we talked about fungi are extraordinarily good at being parasites.
Yes.
It's interesting, though I think not surprising, that this seems to be a thing that plants aren't actually very good at.
Yes.
Comparatively.
And may not need to do. It may not be worth it for them.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it makes sense that a group like animals and fungi that are constantly having to look for sources of nutrients.
Yes, exactly.
Are going to look for novel sources.
And they're already built to take nutrition from other living things.
Your job is to, in your environment, find nutrition and utilize it. Where you find it and how you get it is really up to you. Plants are different in the fact that they already know where their nutrition's coming from. It's coming from up. And so you have to kind of break from your default to go into parasitism with plants.
Exactly. And so it is not surprising that it happened, but it's also not surprising that it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
Well, please tell us about some of the variety of parasites. I'm sure they're not all doing it the same way.
Put a pin in that.
Interesting.
All right. Pinned.
Pinned. So there are technically 6 possible types of parasitic plants, though only 5 actually occur in nature. Okay, so there are 3 categories with 2 options each. So you can be obligate or facultative. So do you have to be a parasite in order to complete your life cycle? It's the same thing with animals. This is not like animals, whether or not they are a stem parasite or a root parasite. So what part of the plant are they infecting?
Yeah.
And then a hemiparasite or a holoparasite. So a hemiparasite, half parasite. Basically, it lives as a parasite under natural conditions, but remains photosynthetic to some degree.
Gotcha.
So it is doing a little bit of photosynthesis. So they may only obtain water and mineral nutrients from the host plant, or they may also get some of the organic nutrients from the plants. But in general, they're not getting everything from their host. Holoparasites derive everything. All of the fixed carbon comes from the host plant. They're not doing anything on their own anymore. So they commonly lack chlorophyll, because what do they need that for?
Sure.
So they tend to be kind of funny colors. They tend to not be green, because you don't need to be, right? You're not photosynthesizing. So hemiparasites, right? The ones that do a little bit of dabbling in photosynthesis still. Those are going to be your mistletoes.
Mm-hmm.
And also Cassia, which is the like paintbrush prairie fire that like when I lived in Texas, you would see these fields of bluebonnets and then random orange flowers throughout them. That was this, because they were parasitizing the bluebonnets. And then holoparasites, these are dodder, which is a very, very common, it looks like just a tangle of plant bits. And it can be across ground cover, it can be in trees. And then Rafflesia, you know, the world's largest flower, is a holoparasite. There's basically nothing to the plant except for flower. That is it.
Rafflesia, the corpse flower.
Not the corpse flower. Stinking corpse lily.
Stinking corpse lily.
Yes.
Is my favorite and arguably the only example of a parasitic plant that I know anything about. So I'm very excited to hear about the one that I know about.
Yes, Rafflesia is great. I mean, it was Pokemon, like...
Yeah, for anybody out there who is not familiar with Rafflesia, it's what Vileplume is based off of.
Yes.
Vileplume's Japanese name is Rafflesia.
Oh, I love that.
Yep.
we are not even pretending that is what this is.
Yep, this is just 100% is just this plant.
So holoparasitic plants cannot be facultative. They can only be obligate parasites, because when you are getting all of your nutrients from your host plant, like, yeah, you got no other options. Like, you got to do this.
Yep, it's parasitism or nothing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, it's like a lot of intestinal parasites where it's like, yeah, you can't move.
Yeah, if you're not in an intestine, you're not surviving.
Yeah, so you're good in one situation.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, it's funny too, because if you look at the morphology, if you just like look at parasitic plants, they are some of the weirdest looking plants you've ever seen.
Yeah, they are.
Because, like, the ones that are, like, hemiparasites tend to look plantier, which makes sense because they are, you know, kind of sort of photosynthesizing at least some of the time.
Well, because then you're just kind of using another plant as your substrate.
Yes.
Right. Well, and this is reminiscent of episode 105 when we talked about carnivorous plants, where carnivorous plants are still photosynthesizing plants.
Yes.
They just have extra tools for getting extra supplements from bugs and stuff.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what the hemiparasites are doing. But yeah, the holoparasites, they are fully committed to this. And so Hydnora and some of the things in that family are described as some of the strangest plants on the planet, because they look like, oh my God, I don't even know how to describe it, because it doesn't look like a plant. It looks like a mouth that would eat you, only very small. But yeah, and they can be herbaceous, they can be woody. There's even within the relatively small diversity of parasitic plants, you can still get many, many, many different types of plants.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So am I correct in thinking that vines fit somewhere within this umbrella, or is that more of a outlier example?
Well, it depends, because there is one thing that makes you a parasitic plant, and not all vines necessarily have it. Some of them are just using whatever they're climbing on as substrate and not actually taking nutrients from it.
Yeah, just a climbing structure.
Yes.
Just to get altitude.
Yes, exactly.
It's an interesting area of overlap, because there are vines will do this. Kudzu is very famous for doing this, where it's not actually directly getting nutrients from the plant, but it does climb all over the plant and sometimes kill the tree that it's on top of.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Not technically parasitizing,
Correct.
but like crowding out and I'm using this tree for my own benefit, and if the tree doesn't survive, that's fine, there's another tree.
Yes, exactly. So there can be vines that are parasitic, but not all vines are parasitic, squares and rectangles.
Okay. Interesting. Fascinating. Well, please tell us about what the things are that allow parasitic plants to do the things that they can do.
So it is pretty much one thing. When we talk about parasitic plants, there is one thing. One
neat trick.
Yeah, there's one neat trick that will allow you to be a parasitic plant.
Trees hate them.
Yes.
Okay, but like really though. So it is a structure called a hostorium.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think that's also what it's called in fungi.
And that's what I was talking about. There is another organism that has the same name for a different but similar structure.
Yes.
Which meant that when I was doing searches, I kept having to exclude fungi. I don't want to talk about those. We already did that.
Yep.
So there is a fungal structure with the same name. I'm not talking about this because I'm talking about plants this time. So it is a hemispherical multicellular root asterisk structure that penetrates the host plant, connecting them to the host vasculature. So this can be xylem, this can be phloem, this can be both. It depends, especially because depending on if it is a hemiparasite or a holoparasite, how much stuff are they trying to get from their host plant? So it comes from the Latin word hostor, which means water drawer or one who drinks, which makes sense. That is exactly what they're doing. It's basically a straw.
I drink your milkshake.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say the idea that it's a structure that pokes into the xylem or flow, right? The fluid transport of plants, like it's siphoning gas.
Yes.
Well, it's mosquito style.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. No, absolutely. It is fascinating.
Plant vampires.
Honestly, yes.
Yeah, plant buyers.
And there are two different ways that you can form these haustoria. So you can have lateral haustoria, where they're basically coming off the sides of the roots, so the areas of elongation. And this is something that you see in hemiparasites or holoparasites. But you can also have terminal haustoria, which is at the very tip of the root apical meristem. So that's the growing part of the root. And you only find this in holoparasites.
Cool. All right.
The important thing to remember, so the root apical meristem. So plants have two directions they grow from. You have the shoot apical meristem, the SAM, and the root apical meristem, the RAM. And those are the two directions that plants can grow.
Up and down / out.
Yes, exactly. Those are your directions. People who study roots get really upset if you just assume that apical meristem is the shoot apical meristem. So I am differentiating here.
Fantastic. Listen, we don't want letters from the root people.
The root people are very nice. I collaborate with root people. But the important thing to note, so the reason I gave that explanation is because once you form a haustorium from your root apical meristem, you can't grow there anymore.
Interesting.
That makes sense. Because now it's inside another plant.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But that's really important to differentiate. And only hollow parasites will do that, which makes sense too. It's this is the only thing I gotta do is plug into this.
Yeah, it's an interesting compare because the first example is you have your root doing presumably normal root stuff, and then it has these accessory structures that might parasitize a plant. Whereas in a holoparasite, your haustorium is at the very tip of the root because that's where the root goes.
Yes.
It's I don't need to be rooted in the soil like a normal plant to absorb. I need to be rooted in that plant's roots over there.
Yeah, and so they can technically do both, but they are the only ones that can do the terminal one.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then the cool thing too, though, is if you do them laterally, you can have way more, right?
Yes.
Because you can make a whole bunch coming off the sides. You're not relegated to I got one. But the way that this initiates is basically there are certain exudates, so things that are exuded, things that are coming from the roots, that the roots of the parasitic plant pick up on, yep, that's where I need to go. That's where I'm going. And it's actually really fast too. I mean, for plants.
Yes.
But the whole process is done within a couple days. So from basically the time that the plant realizes, oh, there's somebody here, it can take 4 to 8 hours. Once they're close enough to oh yeah, we're heading in this direction, they'll start sending out auxin. So that's the compound that leads to this growth in plants, and basically will form a little nubbin, tubercle is the word they use, but I like nubbin, that basically will butt up against the root of the host plant and release cell wall degrading enzymes. Basically just like, all right, we're coming in. And then they will form what's called a xylem bridge. So basically it is this vascular structure that connects the two, the vascular systems of the two plants. And like, okay, we're one thing now. So the host plant is going to therefore send the nutrients, the proteins, the water, whatever, into the parasite. The parasite will send in cytokinin, which is what breaks down cell walls. Basically, it's like, yeah, no, we're going to keep this hole open. we're going to stay connected. But yeah, it can take as little as maybe 72 hours to complete the whole process, which is not nothing.
Yeah.
Wow. It's fascinating to think that the parasite is effectively grafting itself onto the host.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my goodness, thank you for this magnificent transition.
I did. I said a plant word.
Well, it's really interesting because the similarities between Hostoria and plant grafting are surprising. Because for a lot of like fruiting trees, so for example, apples do not breed true. So if you take an apple seed, you plant it in the ground, you grow a new apple tree, it's not going to taste anything like the apple that you took it from.
Yeah.
And so in order to maintain these varieties of apple trees, we have to graft in the tasty trees into basically like the stump. And that's why you can have these trees that have like multiple rosaceous, species on it. But the reason I say that is because normally you're kind of restricted to things that are in the same genus, maybe. Definitely in the same family.
You can't graft oranges onto an apple tree.
Right, those are different. Those like Rutaceae versus Rosaceae, like those are not closely related at all.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I know, mixing apples and oranges does not work, and I get really upset about that. Anyway, but this is something that clearly these parasitic plants have overcome.
Yeah,
because like they are not necessarily attaching them to things that are anywhere closely related to them, which is really interesting, right?
Yeah. Well, they don't have to be compatible.
Yeah.
Only one plant has to maintain the compatibility.
This is true.
That makes me wonder something, because this comes up with animal parasites all the time, where there's a bunch of animal parasites that are specific to a species.
Yes.
To where it's like human lice are not the same as bird lice, are not the same as other mammalian lice. So like these parasitic plants aren't necessarily parasitizing a closely related plant, but do they tend to target a short list or singular plants? Like, is that why they can be specialized, like do this thing that is so difficult?
So I'm going to get into this in a little bit, but no, they do not have to be. Some things are host specific.
Yes.
And some are host preferential, but they're not limited.
Cool.
Interesting. So again, back to your mosquito example.
Yes, exactly.
You don't have to be as picky as some other parasites.
Interesting.
Which makes the fact that they can do this even more interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because like for example, like Rafflesia parasitizes a tree in Vitaceae, which is the grape family. Like they're not closely related at all, but like I was gonna say they're both doing great. That's not true. Rafflesia is doing great.
Well, and it is so interesting because what they're doing is, like you say, grafting their systems together.
Yes.
Which is not what most other parasites, animal parasites that people tend to think of are doing. Like even really, really closely connected host parasite systems, the parasite's still just eating the host.
Right. Yes.
It's just eating, but in a weird way.
Right.
This is more like anglerfish.
Yeah.
Yes. That's
exactly.
what I was thinking.
Which is a male and female of the same species.
Yes.
Which is why they're able to do that.
Like, what this parasite plant is doing is that SpongeBob scene of their hearts connecting him and Squidward. It's just going, we're friends now. We're like brothers, only closer. And I know I made this comparison when we did fungus as well, but still, it fits. Like,
still true.
You're just connecting yourself in a way that is fully alien to how animals do it.
And there are multiple enzymes that are present in the process of plant grafting that are also present in the process of the Hostorium maturing, which makes a whole lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, it's It's kind of horrifying.
Yeah.
It's super cool.
It is very cool.
That's really neat.
Yeah, I love it.
So obviously this is beneficial for the parasite. They're getting nutrients and fluids and stuff. What impact does parasitism tend to have on host plants?
So short answer is many and variable.
Sure. Makes it because they are like animal parasites, I suppose.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in general, parasitism reduces the host productivity and or reproductive effort, which makes sense, right? If someone is siphoning your resources, you're going to be less productive.
Well, it's like when humans, if you've got a really bad intestinal parasite or something, you start to lose some of your vigor. You start to get thinner and whatever.
It's why they used it very, very bad idea-wise, but used it as a diet thing for like tapeworms.
Right.
Because you're not getting the nutrition you're eating.
Something's eating your food.
Someone else is. Yeah.
Yes. So, which kind of leads to, there is often a pattern of stunted growth in the host, particularly if it is a hemiparasite. If you have a large parasitic plant population, for example, if you have like multiple that are infecting the same tree, for example, you can have high mortality rates because if enough things are siphoning out your juices, then yeah, you're going to have a problem.
Yes.
When I lived in Texas, there were mistletoe that would parasitize, what is the common name for that? Hackberry. And it was beautiful because when the hackberry would lose all their leaves, you would still see all of the mistletoe. But oh man, some of those hackberry trees did not last very long after, because there was a lot of mistletoe up there and like it was sucking them dry.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that it's not a one-to-one relationship between like resources taken from the host and given to the parasite. So it's not like for every unit of whatever that is taken from the host, it is going to the parasite, because the parasites apparently aren't the most efficient.
Yeah.
And so it is a way bigger cost to the host than it is a benefit for the parasite.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
They are having to give up more of their nutrients than the parasite actually is utilizing.
Yeah, basically the reduction in biomass of the host is greater than the addition of biomass in the parasite.
Huh.
Yeah.
Rude.
I wonder, is that because they're also having to like fight off a invading thing? Like your immune system is also trying to fight this thing off?
Could be. That would make sense. I'm not sure. Yeah, because that's the thing. I don't know. I do know that there's a negative effect, right, on the host. But I don't know is this, like, are you freaking out in there trying to deal with this?
Is it not only are some of your nutrients being stolen, but your check engine light is perpetually on?
Yes.
And you're trying to balance things.
And it's draining the battery.
Yeah, and you're sending immune system chemicals and reactants to places that are just being ignored by the parasite or counteracted. Right. And so you're just using up extra energy.
Yes. So parasitic plants can be pests of agricultural species. They're actually like pretty devastating. Yeah. Which makes sense because, like I said, even though no monocots are parasite, oh boy, do they like to parasitize monocots.
So, well, if you're not going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
One of us should have fun.
Yes, exactly. And so, for example, in the Orobanchaceae, that family I mentioned earlier, there are at least 2 genera, many species, that parasitize species like sorghum and maize and tomatoes and sunflowers. And so they are really costly to the agricultural industry. And the part of the reason why they are so good at being parasites is they have a lot of adaptations that help them with this, right? So they have very small seeds, so they can be wind dispersed.
Yeah.
And so they can remain dormant until, the species that they want it to attach to is available. And they recognize the stimulants, the germination stimulants is how it was called. So once they germinate, right? Like once they sense, aha, my host is near, they have to initiate the parasitic lifestyle pretty quickly because it is a very small seed and they don't really have a whole lot of their own nutrients. They don't have a lot of their own nutrients.
Yeah, that's not what they're good at.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So they need to plug in really quick.
And if you're a holoparasite, you don't have a way to get extra nutrients on the way to becoming a parasite.
Right, exactly. So yeah, like it's fascinating because there are these many different groups that are parasitizing their friends. You can also get epiparasites. So these are parasites that parasitize other parasites.
Yeah.
That came up in the fungus discussion. Because there are fungi that do that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, parasitism, that's great. Let me parasitize your parasite. It's great.
Look at all these nutrients you got.
Yes. It'd be a shame if something happened to him.
There is no honor among thieves.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But yeah, it's very interesting because there are a lot of these groups that I was looking into, I had never heard of because they are so specialized. You know, my focus is leaves, and woody plants. And a lot of these don't have one, if not both of those things. So it's not something that I ever really came across. But it is really interesting that there are so many of these. I also noticed, and I don't know if this is just because of my Northern Hemisphere, North American bias, but I feel like beaches have a whole lot of root parasites.
Yeah.
Interesting. Beech is the tree for anyone out there who was... Not me. I knew what you were talking about, but, just anyone out there.
Yeah. Fagus grandifolia.
Beaches with 2 E's.
Yes.
3, I guess.
I was trying to figure out what the sand would have to do with it.
Well, like cordgrass and stuff around the beach area.
Yes. This is the problem. See, I can't win if I use common names. I can't win if I use scientific names.
So when we talked about carnivorous plants, we talked about how, because like we were just saying, plants, under most circumstances, plants are fine on their own. There isn't really an impetus to get your nutrition from elsewhere. We talked about how carnivorous plants often do this in environments that are lacking certain nutrients, like nitrogen and things like that.
Right.
Does parasitism in plants tend to show up in consistent circumstances?
No.
Yeah.
All right, just every now and then a plant is like, you know what? I'm tired of fending for myself. Yeah. I'm going to eat this tree.
This job is dumb.
Yeah, I'm done with this.
Yep.
It's so hot out here.
It does. So like I said, they're found in pretty much every biome, terrestrial biome.
Yeah.
In general, it seems like a lot of them, but again, I can't even say the majority, a lot of them parasitize trees, and I think that makes sense.
Sure. Because
they're long-lived and big, and man, depending on the size of the tree and the size of the parasite, it might not have that big of an impact. So that's, that, as a parasite, that's a great investment. You can do that for a long time.
Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head if it's true that elephants have more parasites than other animals, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, I mean,
it's a big space and it's a lot of nutrients that you can steal from.
The example that came to mind for me is it's like barnacles on a whale, where it's like you're not parasitizing off, but like things just live on and in trees, in general. Fungi, like we talked about, animals. It makes sense that there would be plants that'd be like, this is a great place to get off the ground away from herbivores and up toward the sun.
And I would be really interested in better understanding why are some root parasites versus stem parasites? Because it's way easier as a plant to be a root parasite.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially if you are stabbing into the roots with your roots. If they're all in the same place, that's way easier. I saw a paper that hypothesized that possibly mammals, were the ones that first brought mistletoes into the trees.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see a whole lot on this, so I'm not sure, how well accepted this is, because they were originally root parasites, and they are now, mistletoes are definitely stem parasites, right? They're up in the canopy of the trees. And so it could be because we know that small mammals are great seed dispersers.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're climbing up the tree, maybe they brought them with them. Who knows? So that could be. When I was looking at the distribution of these different groups, they are, worldwide, pantropical, Eurasian, right? There didn't really seem to be in it, but it was really variable how many members of a given group were parasitic, right? So like in some families, you have 2 genera, right? Or 1 genus, and that 1 genus maybe has 1 species. And then you have, Santaleles, which is an order with multiple families, with multiple genera, with multiple species. And so even though this is something that has originated 12, 13 times, it still is, it's not widespread, and it is very interesting. And this is something I'll talk about a little bit later, but it is very interesting that even though this arose 13 times, angiosperms decided, okay, there is one way to be a parasitic plant.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they're very consistent about the way that they do it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I am very eager to get on to future parts of the conversation. Before I do, I'm going to ask you one final question before we take our little break. Do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite parasitic plant? Mine is Rafflesia, the whatever Allie told me it was actually called.
Stinking corpse lily, because the
That's
corpse
the
flower
one.
is something else.
Cool. I got those confused.
It's fair. You're not a botanist. I won't. I'm glad you knew the names of any plant, so I will not complain.
Yes.
I do love mistletoe. I really like it. I think it looks really cool. Yeah, when I was living in Texas, and I would go to the dog park, in the winter, winter in Texas just means that there's no leaves on the trees, but it's not cold.
Yes.
Sure.
But I just thought it looked so cool to see these big old bunches. They'll sometimes be called witches' brooms, not to be confused with other types of witches' brooms that trees can form. Anyway, yeah, I gotta say, I am a real sucker for mistletoe. I feel like that is such a stereotypical, obvious answer, but there's a reason. It is cool.
Yeah. Are bromeliads parasitic? Because I know that they grow on.
They are
stuff.
Epiphytes.
Okay.
That means they grow on top of. You are the second person to ask me if an epiphyte was a parasite today.
Yes.
And same thing with the vines. Just because a plant is living on another plant does not mean that it is stealing from the other plant.
So that makes those much more like barnacles, where you're not actually feeding off the whale. You're not connecting to the whale's blood.
Ride.
You're just, the whale is effectively your rock that you're growing on. You don't care that it's helpful that it's moving, but that's not. All right, that makes more sense. All right, cool.
I got you.
Then I don't know if I have a favorite, because that was going to be my answer, but
sure, bromeliads.
It doesn't count.
The cool thing that I remember learning about Rafflesia, about stinking corpse lily, that I think this was in an article that I wrote some time ago, is there was a paper a number of years ago that found that Rafflesia doesn't just steal nutrition from its hosts, but also appears to steal genes from its hosts, that a good chunk of the genome of these plants, I think they have a reduced genome. I think it's a slimmed down genome overall, but they've got a bunch of genes that seem to have come from the grapevines.
Yeah.
Yes.
That they are potentially stealing the genetic machinery of their host to then use it against them.
Yes.
To better infect them.
I definitely saw a couple papers that were talking about horizontal gene transfer from parasitic plants, but oh boy, were they very dense. I'm like, I do not understand this, so that's real cool.
Submit your request now for an episode about horizontal gene transfer.
I will not be we talking to you about horizontal gene transfer.
We'll get a bacteria person to come in and teach us all about HGT. Well, wonderful. Well, hey, this is ostensibly a paleontology podcast, so after the break, let's talk about fossils and stuff.
Yay!
Allie, are there parasitic plants in the fossil record?
No.
Oh. Oh no, it's cacti all over again.
I'm having spiny flashbacks.
Oh, no.
I would be so honest. I did not believe this. Like, I believed this even less than I didn't believe the cacti. I can't even tell you how many hours I scoured, right? I went I was using every keyword I could think of. Because the worst part about it is, it's like, did I make this up? I swear I heard about a parasitic plant fossil that was solidly parasitic plant, and I apparently made that up. It did not exist. I tried. Oh man, I would see papers where there are no parasitic plant fossils. I'm like, that can't be true. That can't be true. There's got to be one. So yeah.
Huh.
So in the outline,
Yes,
the questions are there fossils of parasitic plants? How can we tell? And you'll notice that follow-up question assumes the answer to the first question. So I'm going to replace the second question with the question, why not?
Why?
Perfect, because that was the question that I added to the outline of why not.
Where are they?
Okay, so I was thinking about this. Man, this took over my life for a couple days. I was talking to a friend of mine. He's like, what are you up to? I'm like, I'm still trying to find out if there are any
searching for parasitic plants, which apparently humans have been doing for as long as we've been around.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so I have a couple of hypotheses because there are some fossils of groups that have parasitic taxa in them today. So there's fossil pollen from Santa Lilies. Well, that doesn't mean that this was a parasitic plant. There are just many things in there. Or there is pollen from a genus that today is parasitic, but it is 800 years old. So that's not a fossil. That's not a fossil. And there is a fossil pollen from what looks like it's Orobanchaceae, which today is parasitic. But again, it's pollen. So apart from a pollen record, we don't have anything. So there's a couple reasons for that, I think. So they can often be pretty small. Not all of them, but a lot of them can be pretty small. And some of them can be woody, but a lot of them are not.
Yeah,
and so that could be another thing. Another bit is where they are living.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about the ways that most plant fossils are preserved, most of the most common types of commonly studied plant organs in the fossil record are leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Because, plants have a whole lot of them, so a lot of them are able to show up in the rock record. And what a lot of these parasites don't have? Leaves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, so that's not something. If they flowers tend to be relatively ephemeral, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is a temporary structure that is supposed to become something else. So you're not going to get that. And if you're limited to roots, so roots and stems, which is where these things are infecting, do get preserved in the rock record, but they tend to be way less diagnostic in general, right? It's much harder to tell basically just from vasculature what something is. You can get this is a gymnosperm, this is an angiosperm. And for some groups, for palms, you can get it's a palm, we can get to a family. But it's not something that we can identify very specifically. And you have to bear in mind that the way today that we know that something is a parasitic plant is because of the presence of a haustorium.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is a very small it's a root, right, of a relatively small plant. So this is not a large structure. So basically, unless you have that preserved, that is not something that you're going to necessarily recognize this for sure is unequivocally a parasitic plant. The other thing too, hey, remember when I talked about earlier that I don't know a whole lot about parasitic plants because that is not something that I study. That is not something that I think I come across. So it's kind of like how paleobotanists have all the fungi fossils. I mean, paleobotanists probably do.
Yes.
It is not unlikely that somewhere in somebody's collection there is evidence for a parasitic plant. but would you recognize it? Because it's entangled roots, basically.
Yeah, I was just saying, we were talking about how the parasitic plant basically grafts itself on to the host plant.
Yeah.
Would you even be able to tell in a fossil that that root, this part of the root and this part of the root aren't the same plant?
Yes.
Right, exactly. Because that's the thing. So like in herbarium specimens, if you have a parasitic plant, it is preferable, if you can, to include both the parasite and the host plant. I read a paper recently that was like, include the hustorium, and it's very important to include the hustorium. So like, yes, include the hustorium. That is something that we could do with modern plants. Mm-hmm. But yeah, especially, and the other thing too, so roots, like root parasites, I think would be way easier to actually find.
Yeah.
In terms of identify, that's a whole different story. Mm-hmm. But in terms of find, because it's roots with roots. But stem parasites, I feel like that would be a harder thing to do. Because, again, if you think about petrified wood, like it tends to be partial. It tends to be mostly just trunk.
Yes.
And so again, like, and that stuff gets so beaten up.
Yeah.
So would you even see it? Would you even recognize it? Like, is that something that would even be preserved? So even though these are found in pretty much every biome, so that includes biomes that tend to be present in the fossil record and includes biomes that tend to be not included in the fossil record. But you also have to bear in mind that one of the things that allows plants, especially with their leaves, to be preserved is because periodically, seasonally, etc., they lose their leaves. Mm-hmm. And so these plants aren't doing that. They don't have that cycle. They don't have nothing to lose. And so, yeah, I'm really upset. I was really excited. I was like, oh man, I can't wait to see what the fossil record is going to look like for these guys. And nah.
Yeah, well, because this is not the right, we had fossil examples of carnivorous plants to talk about. We have fossil examples of fungi parasitizing plants. We even had fossil record of carnivorous fungi.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So like all the other examples of stuff like this is there in the fossil record. I think you make a really good point that in all likelihood, it is there in the fossil record.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really hard for us to recognize it.
Yes.
Because when we think about our other parasite examples that we have in the fossil record, right, animal parasites are not always easy to identify as fossils.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But parasitic animals tend to have a suite of adaptations.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Anatomical, morphological adaptations. These mouth parts, these legs that allow it to be a parasite. Whereas, as you've pointed out, parasitic plants have one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
They have one neat trick, and if that thing isn't preserved, then we don't have a way to know. And in the fungus episode we talked about, there are examples of fungal parasites of other fungi, but we know that because we find them in the fossil record on other fungi.
Yeah, right. Parasitizing
them,
yes.
being parasitic fungi doing the same thing we see in fungi today, where it's easier to recognize.
Yes. Well, and I think the fungi example is a good one where if you just found hyphae and mycelium of that parasitic fungi without a host around, would it look different enough for you to go, that's mycelium that's meant to grow into another fungus? Like a lot of these plants, if you found the entire plant intact and were able to go, this has no leaves on it, that strongly suggests, but we don't typically find an entire plant.
Right.
So even if you only found, if it's one that is still photosynthesizing, some hemiparasite, it might still have leaves, so that might not help.
Right.
If you find a flower, do parasitic flowers look different than other flowers potentially?
Not necessarily.
Yeah. So like the parts of the plant still just look like plant parts.
Yes.
So unless you find it with that special structure or in the act of connecting to another root or stem, then you're really lacking in chances to identify this lifestyle.
So I was thinking about that, right? Like during this conversation, I was like, amber, would that work? And I don't know.
Yeah.
Because in general, it's like, when in doubt, what do we need in order to get an exceptional fossil of something that normally doesn't preserve? Yes, amber. But I genuinely don't know if that is even an option. Yeah. And also, is that something that people would even be looking for?
Yeah. Well, especially considering how common plant fossils are in many places.
Yeah.
That you might not look twice at, plant fossil number 112
Yes.
happens to be a parasitized specimen, but you might not see that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's that is the blessing and the curse of paleobotany collections, right? Like for my dissertation, I collected thousands of leaves. I did lay eyes on every single one, but I did not give them all equal time.
Yes.
So like obviously there are things that I missed. Given that I was looking at leaves, I doubt that I missed a parasitic plant. But I mean, one of the fossil sites that one of the localities I worked on Rasinga, R3, had in situ trees with root systems.
Mhm.
So like that is an instance if you have good enough preservation. But again, like the type of preservation that's going to do petrified wood, is that really going to preserve a parasitic plant? I don't know.
Well, and where the Hostoria,
Singular versus plural.
Cool. Where the Hostoria meets the host root, and like you said, it forms that boarding tube.
Yes.
Even if that left, like, if you didn't find the remains of that, or if you found some aspect of it, would that scar be diagnostic to other things that can happen to roots, other invaders and parasites and feeders on the plant?
I don't know, because so they stay attached. The whole point is to stay attached. So I don't know what it would look like if it stopped being attached.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you could necessarily differentiate that from some other kind of a scar. And that's the other thing too, that with a lot of these fossils, there's that like, okay, did this damage happen before or after death?
Yes.
Taphonomy, the study of when did this thing break, is, I don't know if this is something that people have even looked into.
Well, I'm also upset because the next question on the outline is, what are some notable examples? Which also assumes the answer to that first question. So I guess we'll move on from that.
That's so
somewhere
crazy.
out there's just a whole assemblage of parasitic cacti waiting to be discovered, crawling with spiders and Sicilians.
With bats roosting inside.
Yes.
So early transitional bats.
Or the first bats.
The first bats. Allie, I'm hesitant about this next question. What do we know about the origins of plant parasitism?
We don't. Moving on.
And that's episode 206 in 2 weeks.
Okay, hold on. No, not quite. We are limited though, because with our molecular clocks, we cannot anchor them with specifically parasitic plant fossils.
Yes.
Right. So typically when we do a molecular clock, we're using genetic data, comparing different species, estimating how long it took for that level of genetic difference to build up, and from that estimating when their common ancestor lived. But typically we try to calibrate those estimates with examples from the fossil record, because otherwise they can be very non-specific numbers.
Yes.
Yeah, you can end up with ranges that are not at all helpful.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So fortunately, because there are so many groups of parasitic plants, there are so many relatives, non-parasitic relatives that do show up in the fossil record. So for the groups that may have a single genus, etc., that are parasitic, they may have more closer related groups that they can use to calibrate. So in general, like I said, there are 12, 13, I saw both numbers, independent origins of parasitism in plants. Most of these groups seem to have originated in the Cretaceous, because, of course, they did.
Angiosperms, episode 57.
Exactly. And then diversified typically in the Paleogene into the early Neogene. So I saw Paleocene, I saw Eocene, I saw Miocene. So somewhere between 66 million years ago and like 20-ish million years ago, somewhere in there, you tend to see real diversification of these groups. But again, This is looking at primarily at the diversification, the origins of the group that includes the parasitic plants.
Yes.
So obviously they can't, originate before their group originates. But we also don't necessarily, it wouldn't be surprising if this is something that plants figured out really early on, because plants are, constantly surprising me. But like, oh no, we figured that stuff out at the very beginning.
Yes.
But there does seem to be some more specific work looking into mistletoe.
All right.
So mistletoe is a habit. It is not like a specific genus or species.
Oh, what?
All right, that was news to both of us.
Oh, don't worry. It was news to me, too.
Mistletoe is like tree.
How does one toe missile?
Yeah, mistletoe is just a thing that plants do.
So, in general, they tend to be in a single order. But they are in multiple families or subfamilies because taxonomy. But it's not like, you have the mistletoe family. No. It's more of a habit than anything else.
Interesting.
It's very widespread. So you have because this was something that I don't know why I wasn't expecting this, but like the genus that is mistletoe is different in Europe than it is in North America.
Oh, yeah.
That should be a clue.
That should be, like, I had to think about, because I know what it is in North America, and I didn't think about European mistletoe. I didn't realize that it's like widespread in South America.
Oh, cool.
Yes, which again shouldn't surprise me, but I was just thinking about, yes, mistletoe. That is this thing I saw in the hackberries in the park in Texas.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. It has to be, but everyone's kissing. So it has to be found there.
Unsurprisingly, when I was looking into, history and whatever, what do we know about mistletoe? Right? Kissing under the mistletoe.
Yeah.
So that is an English custom.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And there's basically like two versions. There is like any woman under the mistletoe can be kissed, and it's bad luck if she says no, which
gross.
hate that.
Whoa. Oh, no.
Talk about parasitism.
Yeah. Oh, that's direct predation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes. But then in some versions, every time a couple kisses under the mistletoe, you have to remove a berry. And then when all the berries are gone, no more kissing under the mistletoe.
Huh.
That's kind of cute.
All right. Yeah. That one's fun. That's like an advent calendar for kisses.
Yes, I like that. Anyway.
That's cute.
Anyway, I digress. So the mistletoe habit has evolved independently at least 5 times in Santalele, so in this order.
Cool.
The first 2 groups both arose sometime in the mid to late Cretaceous, and they tended to be like wind dispersed. I believe they were root parasites initially. So we have initially them arising sometime in the mid to late Cretaceous. The next group is a little bit later, so it's sometime in the Paleocene, and then the last group shows up sometime in the early Eocene. But in general, all of these groups switched from being root to stem parasites.
Gotcha.
Initially, they were root parasites and then eventually became stem parasites. I wouldn't be surprised if that was a common path. But again, it's really hard. It's hard to say without having a fossil record to be like, yes, look, this one is root parasitizing, and yes, but later on it is stem parasitizing. That having a fossil record is rough.
Well, and it really does. It's an extremely poignant example of why the fossil record is so critical.
Yes.
That we can study how they're doing it today and understand them down to the minutia of how they're functioning. But without that historical perspective, we really are limited in answering fairly straightforward and obvious questions because we cannot put them into context.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because like a lot of the work on this by definition has to be very molecular, and it was so difficult for me to parse to try to get through. And so yeah, and it was one of those things. It's like, am I using the wrong words? Am I not able to find these things? Like, is this something that exists, but I'm not phrasing it in the way, because it's really niche terminology. I was reading these papers they kept talking about sinkers. I'm like, what is a sinker? And apparently that is what they call, oh goodness gracious, people who work in parasitic plants, that is what they call the root structures for endoparasites. It's like, I was so deep in the weeds. Like, I need to back up.
Huh.
This is a lot.
Well, and like you were saying before, there's not that many parasitic plants.
Right.
So there isn't even a lot of modern data to go on. It's hard to say these are the patterns, this is when it evolves, this is how it evolves, because we only have so many options. And it sounds like there's a surprising homogeneity across parasitic plants, that a lot of them have very similar adaptations, are doing very similar things. They don't seem to be living in specific environments.
Right.
So it's hard to say, like, the ones in this order are exclusively like this, and the ones in this order are exclusively like that. It's a relatively limited variety of parasitic plants doing a lot of the same stuff.
Well, it's interesting because they are very similar in ways that are inconvenient and very different in ways that are inconvenient.
Yes.
And you can't really generalize in either direction. And it's really interesting because in general, you have two groups that are very speciose, right? There are two groups that have the majority of the species of these parasitic plants. And they are pretty much used as all of the cases.
Yes.
Which is fine. I get it. That makes so much sense, right? If you're going to do a study on parasitic plants, pick one family that's got a bunch of genera, that's got a bunch of species. But it also meant, it's like, no, I want to know what the really, really weird ones are doing. Because there doesn't seem to be as much of that.
That was exactly what I was just thinking, is that, we've got a dozen origins in these parasitic plants, which, like you were just saying, there's not a ton of, but a dozen origins is a decent number of separate evolutionary times. So even if you get really good resolution on those diverse groups, or if we do find fossils for one of those groups, that might only tell us 1 out of 12 how it happens. We can't assume, it might be reasonable that something similar happened with the other groups, but the timing could be wildly different. The way it happened could be wildly different. There's no way to know that they did the same thing, and it would be irresponsible to assume they did the same thing. So even if we do get lucky with a group or two groups, that's only a tenth of the options.
Right. So that leads kind of nicely into the next point that I was going to talk about, which is the Haustorium. Because just because there's only one way to be a parasitic plant doesn't mean that all Haustoria are the same.
Oh,
now we're getting somewhere.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. We can work with this.
We can save the second half of this episode after all.
I found a quote from a paper that I thought was really nice. That is basically talking that because it is a homoplazy, right? It is a character that a lot of disparate groups have, but there's no reason to imagine that all Haustoria to be similar in their developmental origin or structural organization.
Yes.
Just because everyone has a fin or a wing does not mean they came at it from the same place. And so this is where it got real in the weeds.
Yeah, I bet.
I was like, oh goodness. So based on these analyses across these different groups, there is a convergence in topology. So basically the shape, the arrangement of these tissues as it emerges. So it is a convergent thing, but as it's happening, there can be differences in basically like how you get to the point of having a Haustorium. So just because you are doing this thing, you are drilling into your neighbor, doesn't mean you're necessarily, like, even though they're all plants, right? So they have the same structure that they can pull from, but that doesn't mean that every group is doing it in the same way.
It's the extremely me example that I thought of is there are very common discussions on Lego forums as to how do you build your Lego sets. Do you go by bag number? Do you pour them all at once? Do you pour the bag out each, or do you sort them out? You're all going to end up with the same set that are exactly the same, but the process by which you built it can be very different.
Yes. So remember earlier on when I said root asterisk?
Yes.
I did take note of that.
Huh, okay. So we put a pin in that.
A hemispherical root asterisk.
Yes. One of the most debated issues in parasitic plants is whether or not the haustoria are modified roots or stems or an entirely different structure.
Okay.
Interesting.
Okay.
Right. So this was very fun to read about because they were talking about how they are morphological misfits. Because it is not clear exactly what this is. And it's like, comparing them to some truly bonkers plant groups. So, but that's something like when I first started reading about this, I was like, oh yes, it's a root. Cool. I had to go back into my outline and like, asterisk. We gotta talk about that. So basically, on a functional level, they are acting as roots.
Yes.
They are doing the root job. Parasitic plants depend on their haustoria in much the same way that non-parasitic plants depend on their roots. So regardless of the actual, tissue origin, they are functionally working as roots. And so I love this interpretation that it's like, let's not try to put it root or shoot, but it exists somewhere on a mosaic spectrum of root to shoot.
Interesting.
It's a shroot.
Yes. Are beets parasitic?
Yeah, there you go.
So there may be some parts that are rootier and some parts that are shootier, depending on the group or if it is a lateral versus a terminal haustoria. But yeah, it was kind of fun because I came into this like, oh wow, I bet you there's a bunch of different ways to be a parasitic plant. And then I was like, oh, there's only one way to be a parasitic plant. Huh. And then, okay, there's only one way to be a parasitic plant, but there's a lot of ways to do the one way of being a parasitic plant.
Yeah.
But also we don't know what any of the ways are.
Yes.
This episode has been full of more surprises and unanswered questions than I was expecting.
Same.
This is a very unsatisfying episode. I don't feel like I've learned as much as I expected to learn.
All the things you've learned is knowledge you did not want.
Yeah. It's just a whole bunch of me going, so what do we know about this? Nothing, I guess. My hope is that somewhere out there listening to this episode is a early career paleobotanist who is going to go on to revolutionize the study of plant parasitism.
And this also feels a lot like the discussion of wings in insects, where you've got this really weird structure, but we do not have a fossil record of how it evolved.
Yes.
So we're just looking at the body and going, were you that? Were you that?
Yes.
What were you before you were this wholly unique looking and functioning thing that is now unlike anything else that was there before?
Exactly. And it feels a lot like that because a lot of our understanding of, what on earth is going on with parasitic plants is molecular.
Yeah.
Right? So looking at, okay, what genes, what enzymes, whatever make these different things happen and looking at different rates, for the molecular clock to figure out when. But even modern parasitic plants are like, is it a root? Is it a shoot? Probably.
Yeah.
And then the lack of fossil record is just, somewhere in the future, someone is going to be like, I got this. And I hope you do.
Fascinating.
Well, this has been really interesting to learn about, mostly because I think I was I didn't realize how much I was expecting this discussion to be similar to our discussions about carnivorous plants and about parasitism and fungi. And it seems that it is quite different in a number of ways, that my expectations were wrong about how plants do this and how often they've done it and what we understand about it, which has been really cool to learn, despite my, deep disappointment in all of this lacking knowledge.
So don't worry. We do know some things. So in general, most parasitic plants tend to be hemiparasites.
Sure, makes
right?
sense.
So they tend to do both some photosynthesis, some not. Cool. Only 2 genera, honestly, in 2 different families, do not have any holoparasites in the clade.
Okay.
So both hemiparasites and holoparasites are found in one order in 2 different families. I'm not going to go into the specifics just because, like, it's real in the weeds, which I love using that phrase in my episodes because, yes. But there is a likely order of events for how this may have, or the order that these things may have arisen. So the most, or a likely order of events is that first you have the origin of the lateral haustorium, which is basically the origin of parasitism. So this allows you to have facultative hemiparasites. Next, you would have the origin of the terminal haustorium, which would, this is the origin basically of obligate parasitism, obligate hemiparasites. And then you would have the loss of photosynthesis, which is the origin of obligate holoparasitism. However, it is not clear whether or not this is basically like a linear trajectory that you have, the lateral haustorium, the terminal haustorium, the loss of photosynthesis all in the same lineage, or if they basically evolved separately, that the origin of the terminal haustorium basically came off of the group that already had the lateral haustorium, and then a different branch went on to lose photosynthesis. It's not clear. And because we don't have fossils, it's not something we can really test.
So we don't know if it was like the lineage became partly parasitic and then became better at being parasitic and then became super parasitic, or a lineage became partly parasitic and then one group in there became extra specialized. And then one group within there became even further specialized. Yeah. We don't have that, how widespread was this? Where did it happen? When among the evolution of this clade?
Yes. And that's the thing, right? Because the parasitism is widespread today, right? It's pantropical, it's worldwide, it's Eurasian, it's all over. And so it's not like every plant parasite came from South America or something like that. We don't have this clear-cut answer. So, Will, you mentioned a little bit earlier about, whether or not they're generalists or specialists. That's like, they're kind of both.
Yeah.
So in general, most parasitic plants are considered as generalists.
Gotcha.
There are some notable exceptions. For example, the root parasite, that, prairie fire paintbrush that I talked about earlier, that genus, Cassellea, is known to parasitize more than 100 different hosts.
Wow.
From a variety of different families.
Wow. Which, like we said, is not crazy among parasites. There's tons of parasites that are not picky.
Yeah.
Ticks and mosquitoes and things like that. But this is a very intimate form of parasitism. Like, you're grafting yourself to your host.
Yes.
That is a huge list of things, of hosts that you could potentially do that with. That's crazy.
And in general, shoot parasites tend to have a smaller host range than root parasites.
Okay.
So you can still have shoot parasites that have broad host ranges.
Yes.
Right. So like dodder, what I mentioned before, that can have hundreds of different types of hosts. The tropical rainforest mistletoe has approaching 400 known host species.
Wow.
Yeah. I just need something to climb on, and then I'll stab into you and take your juices, and it's fine. So
easy.
There are parasitic plants that are specialists. So that could be they only live on one or maybe just a few different species. One of the most famous of that, especially in our neck of the woods, right? The eastern forests in North America. So the root parasite is Epiphagus virginiana. Also known as the beech drop, which only parasitizes Fagus grandifolia, which is the American beech.
Okay.
So there are some that are like, this is it. This is my species. Like my ride or die. This is it. And as I mentioned before, there are even mistletoes that will parasitize other mistletoes. They are epiparasites. So yeah, they're doing a whole lot. It's so fascinating because like there's not a whole lot of them, but they are doing the most.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That it's a relatively small group or set list of groups that are very widespread and very successful. They've taken this rare lifestyle and really made the most of it.
Yes, absolutely. I do have a newfound appreciation for parasitic plants.
Yeah.
I would say they're adorable. They are, but with like a face that only a mother could love, kind of adorable, because some of them are kind of funny looking, but I love them.
Yeah. Well, because they're like these weird red and brown.
Yes.
Colors.
Orange. Yeah.
Yeah. The colors that plants aren't supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's well, they look like a growth.
Yes.
as in like when we have a growth.
Yes.
Yes.
And indeed they are.
And they
Yes.
are
They
that.
are a growth.
Well, and there's such an interesting combination of features in the fact that like they're a rare lifestyle for plants, which is not typically what you expect from parasites in other groups, but yet they are a successful life strategy in plants, which is true of most other parasites. So like being a parasite is still a good way to be a plant.
Yes.
It's just rarer that they do it.
Yes.
And that's a very interesting concept because it feels like if it was a tough thing for them to do, it also might be a tough way for them to survive.
Right.
But no, they do very well to the point of being able to basically parasitize whoever they want for some of them.
Yes.
That's a very intriguing combo for them.
Yeah. No, I don't think I would want to be a parasitic plant, but I respect them.
If I was going to be one, I definitely want to be a stem one. I definitely want to be up in the branches.
I would be Rafflesia.
Yeah.
I'm taking genes and I'm killing grapes.
The largest flower.
Biggest flower in the world.
See, I was about to say I'll be mistletoe, but then if I was mistletoe in the wrong time and period, I'd be watching.
You'd be witness.
Yeah. No, stop it.
Well, Allie, thank you so much for taking us on this journey of parasitic plants. Hey, before we wrap everything up, there's one more thing for us to do, and that is patron questions. One of the benefits that our patrons get by supporting us on our Patreon is the ability to ask questions that we will answer here on the podcast. And wouldn't you know it, a bunch of our patrons have questions about plants. Allie, I've got like a sort of an odd combo of questions that are sort of three different questions, but they're related questions. So I'm going to ask them and then you figure it out.
Okay.
So first, Emily asks, if flowering plants have outcompeted conifers in so many other warm parts of the world, we talked about that in episode 155, then why are coast redwoods and giant sequoias not outcompeted by angiosperms in California? And then Danielle asks, if there were no people in the northwest of the U.S., would the redwoods and sequoias, see, this is why these are related, would the redwoods and sequoias bounce back or slowly go extinct? I can think of many animals that are alive now only because of human intervention. Are there plants that are only alive because of human intervention?
Okay, so let's talk about the redwoods and the giant sequoias first. So, I hate this answer, but this is an ongoing process, right? If you are in the middle of things being outcompeted, you don't necessarily notice, right? So in our time, they are still here, but their ranges have been shrinking since the end of the Ice Age. And that is not just our fault. We helped. But it's also important to remember that these species, these groups, were way more widespread previously. So Sequoia affinis, which is related to the coastal redwood, it is the same genus, is a fossil species that was found in the continental interior, right? During the Eocene, for example. So like Fossil Beds National Monument has a whole bunch of fossil redwoods, and that is in Colorado. So they used to be much more widespread. They're paleo-endemics, but now they are restricted, like very restricted.
Gotcha. So they are being outcompeted, just slower.
Yes, exactly. And because part of it is the fact that these trees are incredibly long-lived,
Yes.
right? So they are thousands, hundreds to thousands of years old, and so they could still be sticking around, but they're not necessarily able to replenish their populations.
Yeah, things just in general happen slower for them, including extinction.
Yes, exactly. So if there were never humans, we didn't come and ruin everything. If there were never humans, they probably still would go extinct eventually.
Yeah. Okay.
I would not be surprised, because part of the problem too is that they don't make a lot of seeds. So it's gonna take a while for them to actually extend their range. And so building on to the, can humans help with this? There are groups of people who are doing basically assisted migration. Mm-hmm. And they are planting coastal redwoods further north in the Pacific Northwest. So basically helping them extend their range north. So, even without humans, interfering, I do think that they would probably end up going extinct just because of the reduction of their range over time. But we're trying. So in addition to coastal redwoods, which are actually a very popular ornamental plant, there are a lot. Fun fact, there are a lot of redwoods around the world. Like, they have been planted in a lot of different places. Like, they grow really well in Australia. I visited a grove in Wales. Like, they're all over the place, which is good, right? In terms of preserving the existence of this plant, that's one way to do it.
At least they'll be a very slow invasive if they do turn out to be invasive.
Right, exactly. So in addition to coastal redwoods, you also have other plants that have benefited from human intervention. And I feel like these are kind of cliches to mention. So that's going to be metasequoia, so the dawn redwood, that was endemic to a very small region in China. Ginkgo, which is also endemic to a very small region in China and is grown all over the world. Wallemia, which is endemic to Australia, and basically it was endemic to this national park in Australia. And so I believe it was in 2005, the Australian government basically was like, we want to preserve this. We're going to send cuttings to gardeners, and just like we're gonna send this all over the world and see where it'll grow to see if we can basically maintain genetic diversity for this, in case of emergency. So yeah, basically we're probably in the middle of the redwoods going away, which is very upsetting. And yes, humans have definitely helped plant species not go extinct before.
Yeah.
What about domesticated plants? Like a lot of our crops and stuff, are there plants among those that I'm thinking like domesticated animals?
Yeah.
In many cases, where if we disappeared, they can't survive without our help.
I'm not sure how much trouble plants, even domesticated plants, would be without us. We've done a lot of engineering to them, right? So like first we were doing just like, I would like my teosinte to have bigger kernels, please. Oh, look, I have corn. But I think, like, in general, we have things that are growing, like, we're growing crops in places that, like, maybe that wouldn't be able to grow there normally. But in general, I don't necessarily think that, like, wheat would be forever wiped out if humans weren't around. If for no other reason than, like, there's still wild types of these things. So yeah, I don't know. Plants, here's the thing about plants, is they're pretty resilient.
Yeah, they're good at what they do.
They sure are.
They're very good at what they do.
I could see it potentially being like dogs, where if humans suddenly disappeared, there are a bunch of dog breeds that would die out. Bulldogs, chihuahuas, pugs that have medical issues, have physical issues that mean it's very hard for them to survive without being able to go to a vet.
Right.
But hound dogs, and mutts and your huskies, that even though some of those are very specialized breeds, they've been shown to be able to survive on their own very easily, and they're very robust. Those would just breed and go on to continue a mutt dog lineage. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some plants that we have messed with so much to where it's like, well, this one really can only survive with the process we've done, but plenty of kinds of it would be fine.
Right. Or, we really should never have been growing this species in this place.
Yeah.
It can't live here without our assistance, but all of those places where we grow it, where it could theoretically grow naturally, like those will be fine, but yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to Emily and Danielle for asking those questions. And thank you, Allie, for being here to answer questions about plants that we can't answer because we don't know anything about plants.
Yep.
Listeners, remember that after this episode, there will be a blog post up on our website where there will be links and pictures and stuff for those of you who want to learn more. Also, this episode's coming out towards the end of November, which means that the end of the year is coming up, which means our end of the year Q&A is coming up, which means that the end of the year Q&A form is closing very soon. It's going to be closing at the beginning of December. So if you haven't gotten your question in yet, make sure to go do it. Thanks, as always, to our requesters who requested this episode. Thanks, as always, to all of our patrons whose support we appreciate so much. A special extra thanks to our top-tier patrons, Robert Mart, Melissa Barksdale, Danielle the Bug Lover, and Sarah May, for your extra special support that we appreciate an extra special amount. And, of course, thanks, as always, to our favorite paleobotanist, Dr. Allie Baumgartner, for always being here to teach us things, everything we wanted to know about plants and more.
And more.
Not everything, because we really wanted to know
I was
hoping
for fossils in this episode.
I can only do so much.
There's only, well, listen, everybody, go out and find fossils of parasitic plants, and then we'll come back and we'll edit this episode.
Please
for
do
future
that.
generations. We release episodes every fortnight, and every one of those that ends in a 5 is a plant episode with Allie. So stay tuned for more podcasts from us. Stay tuned for more episodes featuring Allie where we talk about plants and things. And I'm out. I'm out of stuff to say.
Yep.
Rafflesia. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.